In the military records of Nazi Germany, there is a striking image: a woman riding a horse slowly across the yard of Buchenwald camp. Her polished black boots pressed into the dusty ground, leaving tracks between long rows of bowed heads. In the middle of that surviving black and white photograph, she tilts her head and smiles. Her wavy red hair and almost gentle expression stand in stark contrast to her surroundings. To many, that moment looked like a portrait of a noblewoman in the German countryside. But behind her calm face were barracks packed, with thousands of people held captive, people she believed were unworthy of being seen as human. Her name was Ilse Koch. She was born in Dresden to a poor working-class family. She grew up amid economic collapse and the bitterness of a nation defeated after the First World War. Neighbors recalled that she had once been a cheerful girl who liked to help her mother prepare meals. No one could have imagined that decades later, this same woman would be accused of becoming a symbol of corruption and cruelty. As Germany sank into promises of national revival, Ilse Koch and her husband Karl climbed the ranks of the SS. They joined a machine where humanity gradually became secondary. Some believed Ilse was merely a product of an extreme era. Others insisted she relished the power and fear she created, treating the suffering of others as a tool to assert her dominance. Amid countless trials and accusations, questions remain unanswered. Was Ilse Koch truly the principal culprit, or just another link in a system that encouraged violence to the extreme? And what makes an ordinary woman, once she holds absolute power, willing to turn the pain of others into quiet decorations? After the First World War, Germany sank into chaos and despair. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 dealt a crushing blow to the nation's pride. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for starting the war. It had to cede territory and disarm its military. Most severe was the enormous reparations payment, 132 billion gold marks. In today's terms, that figure would equal hundreds of billions of US dollars. The economy collapsed. Hyperinflation in 1923 turned the German mark into worthless paper. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks. People lost all their savings. This led to mass unemployment and widespread poverty. Crowds, desperate for a way out, longed for a promise of national renewal. It was in this atmosphere that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, NSDAP, emerged. They appeared like a flame in the darkness. Hitler possessed powerful oratory skills and a sharp propaganda machine. He stirred up hatred. He denounced the Treaty of Versailles as a disgrace and blamed internal enemies. Jews, communists, and other minorities were declared the source of all Germany's misfortune. There was the promise of a mighty thousand-year Reich. Germany would reclaim its status as a superpower. That promise captivated the poor working class as well as opportunists. For many young men and struggling families, the Nazi Party became the last hope to escape years of darkness. At that time, Ilse Koch was a young woman from a working-class background in Dresden. She worked as a secretary with only a basic education, and she was not immune to the currents of the era. In 1932, she joined the Nazi Party, swept up in its fanatical ideology. In 1934, she met Karl Koch at a time when both were devoted members of the Nazi movement. That meeting opened the path that would lead her into the heart of a brutal machine. Karl Otto Koch was born on August 2, 1897, in Darmstadt, Germany. He came from a middle-class family and had served in the First World War. However, his early military career was unremarkable. After the war, he joined the Nazi Party in 1930. He was quickly drawn into Hitler's extremist ideology. Karl was described as a tall, austere man. He had cold, piercing eyes and an uncompromising manner. In his work, he was always intent on consolidating power and securing personal advantage. Ilse Koch was attracted to Karl's determination and his rising status. They soon developed a relationship. Their shared belief in the thousand-year Reich only strengthened their bond. In 1936, the two married in a ceremony steeped in Nazi symbolism. SS members and swastika banners were present everywhere. This marriage was nothing less than an alliance between two fanatics, ready to serve the brutal machinery of Nazi Germany. For Ilse, it was also the first time she stepped into a world of power. When she had been just a factory worker in Dresden, she had never dared to imagine such a thing. The formal ceremonies and the fearful looks of subordinates pleased her. The privileges granted to the commander's wife seemed to satisfy a deep-seated desire to be recognized and to rise above poverty. Power became a kind of intoxication she could not resist. To explain further, the SS, Schutzstaffel, was a paramilitary organization absolutely loyal to Hitler. It embodied ruthless discipline and cruelty. Its members were trained to see prisoners, from Jews and Romani people to political opponents, as enemies of the Reich. Buchenwald was different from the infamous extermination camps in Poland like Auschwitz or Treblinka. It was not designed to kill masses of people in gas chambers. Instead, Buchenwald existed as a massive forced labor center located inside Germany itself. Covering more than 4 square kilometers, it became one of the largest SS camps. It held many different groups of victims. Throughout its operation, the camp received over 250,000 people from across Europe. They were turned into a workforce serving the war effort. Prisoners were forced to work, to the point of exhaustion in weapons factories. They endured hunger, beatings, and the constant threat of death. In this environment, individuals like Karl and Ilse Koch were given absolute power. Karl Koch advanced quickly within the SS thanks to his ruthlessness and blind loyalty. When he was appointed commandant of Buchenwald camp in 1937, he brought Ilse with him. As the commandant's wife, Ilse became an Oberaufseherin, taking charge of supervising the female prisoners. The Koch family was seen as the model of the new Nazi family. They were both devoted to the ideals of the Reich and living in luxury on the edge of brutality. Some believed that in the beginning her role was simply to maintain the image of a model wife. She mainly managed household logistics and set an example for female staff. But as their power grew, the line between administrative duties and personal privilege gradually disappeared. In an atmosphere where humanity was regarded as secondary, many actions started to seem normal, as long as they maintained discipline and kept the camp operating efficiently. The silent complicity of the SS leadership allowed many behaviors that exceeded any standard to become accepted. And from merely being allowed to supervise, she began to grant herself the right to decide the fate of others. Within the brutal system of the Buchenwald concentration camp, Ilse Koch became known as the Witch of Buchenwald. As the commandant's wife, Ilse found a new identity in absolute power. From an anonymous working-class girl in Dresden, she had become someone the guards feared. She stood above tens of thousands of prisoners. Any act of resistance, no matter how small, was seen by her as a direct threat to her status. To protect her throne within the camp system, Ilse used violence as a tool to assert her authority. From shouting orders to commanding brutal punishments, she showed no hesitation. In the early years at Buchenwald, Ilse's role was noted as that of a woman who maintained order. She was responsible for overseeing the community of SS officers and their families. She supervised the living quarters and organized household operations. But SS records and witness testimonies indicate that she began to change during this period. Some recalled that at first, Ilse seemed unsettled by the environment of imprisonment. However, as her position became more secure, she started to intervene more directly in the camp's operations. However, Ilse Koch was not a simple character. Witnesses at Buchenwald described her as a cold and calculating figure. She always appeared impeccably groomed, with neatly brushed blonde hair and a look of contempt in her eyes. She would walk through the barracks, selecting prisoners for brutal punishments. But the servants in her private residence told of contrasting moments. She could speak softly and even appear kind. Then, without warning, she would order the punishment of a prisoner without any trace of emotion. This contradiction revealed an Ilse who had been corrupted by power and her surroundings. Absolute power had nurtured cruelty. The rare glimpses of humanity only underscored the depth of her moral decay. In the post-war trials, some witnesses described her as someone who found pleasure in seeing others afraid. In her own testimony, Ilse insisted she was only carrying out her assigned duties. She said, if discipline was not maintained, everything would collapse. To her, fear and violence were not shameful, but simply part of the job. When power became the measure of her worth, Ilse Koch gradually came to believe that all her actions were justified. But that absolute power only lasted during the early years. As the war entered its most brutal phase, hidden problems began to emerge behind the walls of iron discipline. In the stifling atmosphere of the Buchenwald concentration camp, rumors started to spread among the SS ranks and camp staff. Ilse Koch was increasingly under suspicion. Why did she intervene so deeply in the punishment of prisoners, far beyond her usual supervisory role? Why did the Koch family maintain such an unusually lavish lifestyle? Their house was filled with expensive furnishings, standing right next to the forced labor camp. These quiet questions came from SS officers themselves. Some began to question Ilse's brutal punishments, beatings and executions that seemed more and more unreasonable. Internal reports from lower-ranking SS officers were sent up the chain of command. They pointed to signs of abuse of power and embezzlement, undermining the Koch family's image as exemplary loyalists of the Reich. But the reports were quickly dismissed under the pretext of prioritizing camp stability. The contrast between the Koch's lifestyle and the misery of Buchenwald prisoners only fueled deeper resentment. While tens of thousands of inmates lived starving, crowded into freezing barracks, the Koch family built an equestrian arena worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. It stood right next to the compound. Their home was filled with expensive items from luxurious furniture to jewelry. Such levels of extravagance were completely out of proportion with a camp commandant's salary. Rumors about items made from human skin, such as lampshades or book covers, further deepened the cracks. This ostentatious lifestyle, set right beside the suffering of tens of thousands of prisoners, became a vivid testament to the Koch family's moral decay. And the authorities could not turn a blind eye forever. In 1943, the SS launched an internal investigation targeting Karl and Ilse Koch. The inquiry focused on allegations of corruption and embezzlement of property from the camp. Officers were ordered to secretly gather evidence, from financial ledgers to statements by camp staff. They documented suspicious expenses, including funds used to build the riding arena and the purchase of luxurious items for the Koch household. Several witnesses claimed that Ilse frequently confiscated prisoners' belongings, from money to personal effects, to enrich her family. Even under investigation, Ilse and Karl believed their loyalty to the Nazi Party, and their ties to high-ranking officials would protect them. However, Ilse's brutal conduct became increasingly difficult to conceal. Unjustified executions and punishments directed even at innocent prisoners grew more frequent. Rumors that she selected victims arbitrarily created an atmosphere of fear and tension throughout the camp. Even those who had long remained silently complicit began to question the legitimacy of her actions. Faced with these accusations, Ilse adamantly denied all suspicion. She dismissed them as jealousy from colleagues or subordinates. She insisted that every action she took was simply necessary discipline to maintain order in the camp. Yet her anxiety began to show in her defensive manner. The internal investigations, however slow, marked the first cracks in Ilse's hold on power. The veil of power surrounding Ilse and Karl Koch at Buchenwald began to collapse when the SS and the German military police launched a formal investigation. This was a serious procedure aimed at allegations of abuse of power as well as signs of corruption. SS investigators searched the Koch family's private residence. They seized financial records, luxury goods, and numerous items linked to suspicious assets. The atmosphere at Buchenwald grew more tense than ever. Prisoners and camp staff, once intimidated by Ilse's brutality, began to come forward to testify. They described her cruel actions. She had ordered prisoners to be whipped with leather straps until they bled. She also cut food rations, causing many to starve to death. Some witnesses described how Ilse walked through the barracks with a cold stare. She selected prisoners for punishment simply because of a disapproving glance or an unintentional gesture. One person recounted how she once laughed while watching a prisoner beaten unconscious. She even ordered the execution of people who had committed no offense at all, merely to assert her authority. Additionally, other witnesses provided details. Ilse ordered prisoners with tattoos to be selected and handed over to the medical department, then turned them into horrifying gifts. These testimonies, combined with evidence of embezzling prisoners' property, painted a clear picture of Ilse's cruelty and greed. The truth gradually emerged, and the control she had once held began to slip from her grasp. The greatest shock came when Karl Koch himself was arrested by the SS in late 1943. Karl had always believed that absolute loyalty to the Nazi regime would be his shield. He crumbled under the betrayal of the very system he had served. Karl Koch was stripped of his command at Buchenwald and escorted to Berlin for interrogation. Ilse was also removed from Buchenwald and placed under house arrest to await trial. In the prison cell, Ilse Koch faced the SS investigators in a tense interrogation. Sitting upright, her blonde hair carefully combed, she maintained her initial air of arrogance. She coldly denied all accusations of corruption and brutality. "I was only enforcing discipline," Ilse replied when questioned about the brutal beatings and arbitrary executions at Buchenwald. The investigators held financial records. They compared them with testimonies from prisoners, pressing her with evidence of embezzlement and abuse of power. Gradually, Ilse's confidence began to falter. She started blaming subordinates and insisted she was merely following orders. The coldness in her eyes began to show a hint of panic, especially when questions turned to the rumors about human skin artifacts. Though she tried to remain composed, her voice started to tremble. The anxious glances she cast around betrayed the isolation of the Witch of Buchenwald. As for Karl, he was convicted of corruption and abuse of power. The indictment also charged him with unlawful killings, including executions carried out to cover up embezzlement. He was tried by the SS itself and sentenced to death. Karl was executed by firing squad at Buchenwald in April 1945, just before the end of the war. The two were no longer symbols of the new Nazi family. They were merely figures discarded by the very regime they had once worshipped. The SS, which had praised their cruelty when it was useful, now turned its back to protect the organization's image. But the real trials were yet to begin. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Ilse Koch was arrested by the Allied forces. She was brought to trial at the Dachau War Crimes Tribunal, organized by the U.S. military court in 1947. It was a public proceeding where her crimes were laid bare before the world. In the crowded courtroom at Dachau, the American prosecutor read a lengthy indictment, listing the charges: torture, murder, and abuse of prisoners at Buchenwald. Ilse sat in the dock, facing the angry stares of witnesses and international observers. The prosecutors presented a series of pieces of evidence against Ilse. Financial records seized from the Koch family home showed they had embezzled large amounts of property, from cash to jewelry. Witnesses, mostly surviving prisoners, took the stand one by one. They described her acts of cruelty. The most shocking accusation was the rumor that she had used material taken from victims to create decorative objects. Lampshades and book covers were now formally presented as criminal evidence. These testimonies, combined with the seized documents, exposed Ilse's brutality to the public. Throughout the trial, Ilse at first maintained an air of arrogance, denying all charges in a firm tone. As she had during interrogation, she insisted she was only maintaining discipline and called the witnesses liars. One particularly startling moment came when she claimed to be pregnant, forcing the trial to pause for verification, a move widely seen as an attempt to seek leniency. Gradually, her eyes showed confusion, her voice began to tremble, and her gaunt face could no longer hide her collapse. Public opinion and the international press, especially American and Allied newspapers, turned her into a symbol of Nazi cruelty. Images of her in a prison uniform, a stark contrast to her previously immaculate appearance, were widely circulated. They sparked public outrage. People were horrified to learn that a woman could commit such crimes. The final verdict was delivered. Ilse was sentenced to life in prison in 1947. However, the sentence became controversial when it was reduced to just 4 years due to a lack of direct evidence for some of the charges. This decision ignited a wave of anger and led to a retrial by West Germany in 1951, where she was again sentenced to life imprisonment. The consequences did not end with Ilse herself. Her son, who was born in prison, was sent to an orphanage and grew up stigmatized, carrying the dark legacy of his mother. After the Dachau trial in 1947 and the retrial in West Germany in 1951, the name the Witch of Buchenwald became a symbol of moral corruption. It served as a reminder that human beings, no matter how ordinary they may seem, can turn into monsters under the power of authority and toxic ideology. On a moral level, the story of Ilse Koch raises the question: what leads an ordinary woman, once an anonymous secretary in Dresden, to torture and kill without remorse? Ilse was not born a psychopath. She was a product of a Nazi ideology that classified people as either superior or inferior. Her case forces us to ask, when a system encourages cruelty and suppresses compassion, can any individual truly preserve their moral values? Or will they be swept away by the current of evil? On a societal level, Ilse Koch's case exposed how a broken society can enable figures like her to rise. Post-World War I Germany, with its hyperinflation, unemployment, and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, became fertile ground for extremism. Why did those around her, from camp staff to SS superiors, remain silent or complicit in her crimes for so long? This silence reflected a society that had lost the ability to restrain itself. In that environment, Fear and fanaticism drowned out the voice of justice. On a psychological level, Ilse Koch's story poses haunting questions about human nature. How could a woman described as having moments of kindness in her private life commit such brutal acts? The contradictions in her character reveal how the human mind can be divided by power and ideology. On September 1st, 1967, Ilse Koch hanged herself in her prison cell in Aichach. She left behind a suicide note, still claiming she was innocent. Her body was quietly buried in an unremarkable cemetery. This case stands as a reminder: when power goes unchecked and people abandon moral responsibility, evil can grow silently and thoroughly. It can take root, even in those who once appeared perfectly ordinary.